Tonight, we are not looking at a routine headline. We are not following a campaign speech, a celebrity scandal, or another fast-moving social media argument. Tonight, we are stepping into one of the oldest, hardest, and most disturbing questions in public life. What is the right thing to do when every available choice carries blood on it? This is not just a legal question. It is not just a philosophical question. It is a human question. A question that reaches into fear, survival, duty, law, conscience, and the uncomfortable space where reason and emotion collide. It is the kind of question that seems simple from a distance, but the closer you move toward it, the more unstable the ground becomes. Imagine this. You are driving a trolley car. It is moving at full speed. The brakes have failed. Ahead of you, 5 workers are standing on the track. You know with certainty that if the trolley continues forward, all 5 will die. Then you notice something else. Off to the side there is a second track, and on that side track there is one worker. Your steering still works. You can turn the trolley away from the 5, but if you do, the one worker on the side track will die instead. That is the question. Do you turn the trolley? For many people, the answer comes immediately. Yes, turn the trolley, save the 5, even if that means one person dies. The reasoning sounds direct, practical, and coldly logical. If death cannot be avoided, then fewer deaths are better than more deaths. One life lost is tragic, but 5 lives lost are worse. The math seems obvious. But now change the scene. This time, you are not driving the trolley. You are standing on a bridge above the track. The trolley is again racing toward 5 workers who will die if nothing stops it. Standing next to you on the bridge is a large man. If you push him over the bridge, his body will stop the trolley. He will die, but the 5 workers will live. Now what do you do? Something strange happens here. Many of the same people who were willing to pull the switch in the first case are suddenly unwilling to push the man in the second. The numbers have not changed. One death still saves 5. The result is still 5 lives preserved at the cost of one. And yet, for most people, these 2 cases do not feel morally identical. Why? That why is where the real story begins. Because what looks like a simple numbers game turns out to be something deeper. When people approve of turning the trolley but reject pushing the man, they reveal that for them morality is not only about outcomes, it is also about the nature of the act itself. It matters whether you redirect a danger or directly use an innocent person as a tool. It matters whether someone dies as a side effect or because you deliberately made that person the means to an end. And just like that, we move from instinct to philosophy. One way of thinking says the right action is the one that produces the best overall outcome. This is often called consequentialist reasoning. In plain language, it means actions are judged by what they lead to. If an action reduces suffering, saves more lives, or creates more overall good, then it has a strong claim to being the right action. But another way of thinking says some actions are wrong in themselves, no matter how useful the result may be. In that view, morality is not just about counting bodies or measuring benefits. It is about duties, limits, and principles that should not be violated even for a seemingly better outcome. These 2 approaches have shaped moral and political thought for centuries, and they do not stay in philosophy classrooms. They appear in courtrooms, hospitals, military decisions, public policy, and moments of emergency where there is no time for perfect answers. And that brings us to one of the most haunting real cases ever used to test this debate. In the 19th century, a British yacht called the Mignonette sank in the South Atlantic. 4 survivors escaped in a small lifeboat: Captain Tom Dudley, First Mate Edwin Stevens, Sailor Edmund Brooks, and a 17-year-old cabin boy named Richard Parker. They were stranded far from shore with almost no supplies. For a brief time, they had a tiny amount of food. Then they had almost nothing. They caught a turtle that kept them alive for a few more days. Then that too was gone. No fresh water, no rescue, no certainty, only heat, salt, weakness, fear, and the slow collapse of the human body. Richard Parker, the youngest among them, became especially sick after drinking seawater. He was weak, delirious, and close to death. The others watched him fade. Days passed, hope thinned, hunger deepened, and then, in that floating prison of desperation, a decision began to form. The captain proposed that one should die so the others might live. There was talk of drawing lots, but no proper lottery took place. No fair procedure settled the matter. No meaningful consent was obtained. Instead, after many days without food and water, Dudley killed Parker with a knife. The others then fed on the boy's body and blood. A few days later, they were rescued. That is not fiction. That is history. When they returned to England, the facts were not seriously disputed. The defense was necessity. They argued in effect that the killing was the only way to survive. Better one death than three. Better a life already slipping away than the loss of everyone. In the brutal arithmetic of survival, they claimed they had done what reality forced them to do, and this is where law and morality begin to pull against each other. From one angle, the case seems horrifying but understandable. People sitting safely on land often speak with confidence about what they would never do. But starvation, dehydration, and the terror of certain death change the mind. Under extreme deprivation, judgment itself may begin to fracture. What looks clear in comfort becomes cloudy in catastrophe. That is why some people feel sympathy for Dudley and Stevens. They see men at the edge of life making a terrible decision under unbearable pressure. They do not celebrate it, they do not call it noble, but they hesitate to condemn it in the same way they would condemn an ordinary murder on dry land. They ask whether choice means the same thing when every path leads to death. They ask whether law should leave room for human breakdown in impossible circumstances. But there is another side, and it is powerful. That side says, no matter how desperate the situation, murder is murder. The moment we allow necessity to justify killing an innocent person, we cross a line that becomes very difficult to redraw, because once survival becomes a legal or moral defense for intentional killing, what principle remains to protect the weak, the inconvenient, the isolated, or the expendable? If one person may be killed to save three, then what about one to save 30? Or one to save 100? Or one socially marginal person to protect many others considered more useful? The danger is not only in this case, the danger is in the rule it creates. That is exactly why this case has lasted so long in moral and legal debate. It forces us to confront a terrible possibility. Maybe numbers alone cannot decide what is right. Maybe there are things a decent society cannot permit, even when the result seems efficient, or even compassionate from a distance. And yet, even that does not end the argument, because once we reject pure survival logic, new questions appear. Would it have changed anything if Parker had consented? Suppose the cabin boy had been awake, aware, and able to speak. Suppose he had said, I am dying anyway. Let my death save the others. Would that make the killing morally different? For some people, yes. Consent changes the moral structure. It transforms the act from pure taking into self-sacrifice. It introduces agency where previously there was only victimhood. But others reject that too. They argue that consent given under extreme desperation is not free in any meaningful sense. A starving, dying person trapped at sea with stronger men around him is not negotiating as an equal. Even if he says yes, the setting itself is coercive, the pressure is built into the situation. In that view, consent cannot wash away the moral stain. Then consider another variation. What if all four had agreed in advance to a fair lottery? What if each person accepted the same risk and chance selected who would die? To some, that feels more just. A lottery treats everyone equally. It avoids the strongest deciding that their lives matter more than the weakest. It creates a procedure rather than an act of domination. And yet, even there, many remain uneasy, because a fair procedure does not automatically make the result moral. A lottery can distribute risk equally, but it cannot settle whether the act itself should be done at all. Fairness in selection does not answer the deeper question. May human beings deliberately kill an innocent person and consume the body simply because the circumstances are desperate? This is where the old philosophical divide becomes impossible to ignore. On one side stands the logic often associated with utilitarian thinking. The right act is the one that maximizes overall welfare, happiness, or survival. Jeremy Bentham, one of the most influential thinkers in this tradition, argued that human beings are governed by pleasure and pain, and that moral and legal reasoning should aim at the greatest good for the greatest number. In simple terms, if one terrible act prevents a greater disaster, then the act may be justified by the balance of consequences. That way of thinking has enormous force. Governments use versions of it all the time. Hospitals must ration limited resources. Military commanders weigh civilian risk against strategic outcomes. Public policy often chooses what benefits the many, even if some pay a cost. We do not live outside consequence, we live inside it. But on the other side stands a different conviction, that human dignity cannot be reduced to a calculation. This is the moral world associated with thinkers like Immanuel Kant, who argued that persons must never be treated merely as means to an end. In that view, a person is not a spare part for society's convenience. A human life is not a number to be traded whenever the arithmetic looks favorable, and perhaps that is why the organ transplant example unsettles people even more than the trolley. Imagine 5 patients in a hospital, each in desperate need of a different organ. A healthy man comes in for a routine checkup. If the doctor kills him and distributes his organs, 5 patients live. If the doctor does nothing, the 5 die. By the numbers, 1 death saves 5. But almost nobody accepts this as morally permissible. Why? Because here the innocent person is not merely in the path of danger. He is being turned into raw material. He is being used. That difference matters deeply to how many people experience moral reality. The same discomfort appears in public life whenever leaders speak as if some people are expendable for a larger goal. Whether in war, economics, or emergency governance, society becomes dangerous the moment certain lives are treated as acceptable losses without strict moral limits. So what did the court do in the real case? The judges rejected necessity as a defense to murder. Dudley and Stevens were found guilty, though their sentence was later reduced. The ruling sent a message larger than the fate of those men. The law would not endorse the principle that one innocent life could be intentionally taken simply because others might benefit. That judgment has been debated ever since. Some see it as morally essential, others see it as too rigid, too detached from human extremity. But maybe that tension is exactly the point. Law often draws hard lines precisely because real life provides endless reasons to blur them. And maybe that is why these cases remain so powerful. They do not merely ask us what we think, they reveal how unstable our thinking can become under pressure. We say numbers matter until touching the decision feels like murder. We say consent matters until consent seems corrupted by desperation. We say principles matter until survival begins to tear at them. The truth is, moral judgment becomes hardest not when good confronts evil, but when two terrible choices stand side by side and demand an answer. That is why questions like these do not disappear. They return again and again in new forms. In medicine, when there are too few ventilators. In war, when one strike may save many and kill innocents. In law, when justice for one conflicts with security for many. In politics, when leaders ask the public to accept sacrifice for the greater good. And in private life, when people discover that being decent is easy in theory and painfully difficult in crisis. There is also a warning hidden inside these thought experiments and historical cases. The warning is that comfort can make us arrogant. It is easy to judge the starving sailor, the panicked driver, the overwhelmed doctor, or the terrified witness from a safe distance. But the purpose of moral reflection is not only to condemn or excuse. It is to understand what values we would defend before the crisis comes and what lines we believe should never be crossed, even when every excuse is available. And that is why the study of justice is so unsettling. It does not simply give you information. It changes the way you see. It takes things that seemed obvious and makes them strange. It exposes the tension between instinct and principle, between sympathy and judgment, between compassion and law. Once that happens, you do not return unchanged. A society that never asks these questions becomes shallow, but a society that asks them honestly must also accept the discomfort that follows, because there may be no perfectly clean answer. There may only be the effort to reason carefully, to protect dignity, to resist cruelty dressed as logic, and to remember that the people inside. These dilemmas are never just examples. They are human beings, and maybe that is the final lesson. Justice is not only about rules, it is not only about feelings, it is not only about outcomes, it is the struggle to decide what we owe one another when fear, power, survival, and principle all demand different things at once. So if you were at that switch, what would you do? If you were on that bridge, what would you refuse to do? If you were in that lifeboat, what would remain of your morality after 19 days without food or water? And if you were writing the law for everyone else, would you build it around mercy for desperation or around an unbreakable line that says some acts cannot be justified, no matter the circumstance? That is not just a classroom question. That is not just philosophy. That is the question at the heart of justice itself.